All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the MRS vendor training session. Today is July 24th. Thanks for joining us here today. The purpose of this session is to review some pressing issues related to MRS and vendor interactions and to go over some of the most common topics that we get questions from vendors regarding. Before we jump in, though, we have some housekeeping to go over. This session is being recorded. It will be saved to the public MRS website and emailed to all registrants following the session. Um, Throughout the session, please ask any questions you have inside the Q&A section of Zoom. You can see that if you move your mouse inside of Zoom, a toolbar pops up, and Q&A is one of those options, and you can submit questions that way. We're going to take pretty much the full hour today, we think, presenting material. And we will take all the questions that are submitted in the Q&A throughout the session and in the post-meeting survey. And we'll create a Q&A document where we answer all those questions, and we'll send it out to registrants and post it on our public website along with the recording. A lot of the questions we get involve like federal and state regulations, MRS policy, sometimes specifics in your area. So rather than answering extemporaneously, it's better for us to take some time to think about the question, do some reading, and put together a thoughtful answer. So that's our thinking there with putting together a Q&A document that we'll send out after. Third, we have captioning available. We have a cart captioner here today. If you, again, move your mouse inside of Zoom, you should see a CC or captioning button on that toolbar. It looks a little different depending on what version of Zoom you're using, but you should be able to click that and open up captioning inside the session. And then lastly, we do have a survey that I mentioned. When you exit the session here today, you'll be automatically directed to a survey. It'll pop up in a web browser. It's short, only like 4 or 5 questions. It'll only take a minute or two to complete. So we would really appreciate it if you took a minute to complete that survey. It will inform future information sessions with vendors, and it's another opportunity to ask any questions you have to us. This is our agenda for today. I did send it out to registrants prior to the session. We're first going to have a welcome and purpose. We're going to review the MRS vendor manual. We're going to talk about the importance of dates that are listed on authorizations. We're going to narrowly focus on monthly progress reports, one of the universal statewide reporting standards that MRS has. And we're going to talk about timely billing, communication, and end of fiscal year processes. We're going to talk about MRS's efforts to vet vendors, rates of payment, and then after that, lease cost policy and comparable services and benefits. And then we'll have some closing remarks and we'll adjourn. We anticipate this session taking about an hour. We should be done at about noon Eastern time here today. So first up, I would like to welcome Bill Addison. Bill is the division director over MRS's Performance Enhancement Division.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our Michigan Rehabilitation Services vendor training. We greatly appreciate your attendance here. We have record number attending this seminar today. We have over 230 folks who have registered, which is a great response for us. We also have, since the beginning of the year, have 140 new vendors who have registered with us to provide services, which is another great item for us, because we greatly need our vendors, and the more vendors we have, the more opportunities that we have to provide services here. So let me give you a little background on what we want to do today. What the objective here is to identify the major issues that we believe that vendors should know about in doing business with us. So the agenda that you just seen there, Tyler provided for you, is kind of a result of those meetings that we had about those issues. And what we're going to do today is we're going to structure this in such a format that I'm going to be your host. So I'm going to introduce both the individual who's providing the information and their topic. And the reason we're doing 2 of these is that one of the things we want to do is introduce to you the folks that are employed here at MRS and who do these certain functions. Because one of the things that we came up with in our meetings about what we believe vendors should know is have good communications with MRS. So with that, what I want to do is I'd like to introduce to you, is Maureen on, Tyler?
Yep, Maureen's here.
I'm here.
Hello, Maureen. Could you give us a few words, please? She is our deputy director.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Good morning, everyone. Happy to be here, and thank you so much for taking time out of your day to to hear from us. Just want to start with thanks, as Bill had said. We can't do this work without you. You're a critical partner with us in helping people with disabilities become employed and live better lives. So we really appreciate everyone joining today and hearing our operational needs when it comes to getting our authorizations in a timely manner, as well as just making sure we're moving things along, not only for our customer to get to where they need to be more quickly, but also for our own and your operations. We know it's critically important to be able to forecast and think about the future so we can serve as many individuals that are interested in working as possible. So you'll hear the speakers today talking about the need to turn around authorizations maybe more quickly than you've been used to in the past, getting accurate reporting and making sure that we ensure that our customers are in good hands, and we know they are. It's verifying and making sure of that along the way, that we have those controls in place. One more thing, I know Sigrid Adams, our Bureau Director, and I, along with our executive team, have talked a lot about engaging more with our vendor group. As I said, you're a critical partner. We cannot do this work without you. So we are going to be trying to engage with you more frequently in the next year and years to come. We'd like to do some newsletters. We'd like to do more interaction in webinars, and also just hear back from you as far as your experience working with MRS. Communication works both ways, so we want to make sure it's effective both ways. So hearing from you and having that feedback loop is really, we think, going to have a positive impact moving forward on our operations. So I appreciate you all being here. I'm looking forward to the content today, and thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Maureen. Tyler, next slide. So before we get into the mechanics of the processes that we're going to talk about, I want to talk to you about some of our objectives today. First objective is to provide some background information concerning how MRS operates. And again, what we're going to talk about is how we are federally funded and have to comply with many different requirements, both on the federal level and the state level. And the second item here is to create a cohesive process between MRS and the vendors. And again, a lot of the topics that we're going to talk about today are issues that we want to address with our vendors so they know how to process such things as reports and invoices to us, to make sure that we grease the gears between the two organizations. And the last thing, and we're going to bring this up several times during the seminars, identify and discuss resources available to vendors. And what that is how we can communicate better with vendors. Next slide, please, Tyler. All right, so the background information is the first thing to know about us is that we are federally funded. A payment to you is a federal dollar, and that requires us to comply with a bailiwick of requirements in processing that money to a vendor. So many of these topics that we're going to talk about are requirements to us from our federal funding source. The next thing I want to talk about is kind of narrowing the scope of exactly what we're talking about. We have 140, hopefully 140 new folks attending this seminar. We need to identify the difference between an authorization and a standardized contract. So what we're going to talk about today is services that we purchase using authorizations. So for those vendors who have been with us for a while, you know what an authorization is. It is a kind of a 1 or 2 page document that identifies the services that we're purchasing. That's only one of 2 methods that we use to obtain services for vendors. The other way is our fixed cost contracts. Today, we will not be talking about fixed cost contracts. Today, our discussions will be limited to transactions that we interact with you using authorizations. Go to the next one, please. All right, so identify and discuss resources. So today, you're going to be introduced to our Leo webpage, which we are a part of. Our next session that we're going to talk about in a few minutes is our vendor manual. Our vendor manual has so much information for vendors. It kind of tells you how to make soup in many different ways. the last thing we want to talk about, Maureen has already brought this up once, and we'll probably bring it up again, is just the interactions between vendors and us. So we get to know each other, what our needs are and what the processes are. So Tyler, if you can go to the next one, please. All right, so here's where we want to introduce to you our vendor manual. If you have not seen our vendor manual, my recommendation is you go to the webpage and you look at this information that we have put on there. Our purpose of putting that information is to inform you about the mechanics of our systems that we use. And I want to introduce Tyler to you. He's the one that opened for us. He has a repeat performance right now, and we're going to have him repeat a few more times down there. He is one of the major contributors to the vendor manual. He understands the mechanics of this. Again, if you have any questions at the end about our vendor manual, Tyler is going to be the person that's probably going to respond. So go ahead, Tyler, tell us about the vendor manual.
All right, I appreciate it, Bill. As Bill said, my name is Tyler Gross. I'm a policy analyst with the agency. Thanks for being here, everyone. As Bill indicated, the vendor manual is a comprehensive resource outlining key information that vendors should know when working with MRS. It includes the expectations and requirements and processes that vendors should be aware of when working with MRS. It's a long document. It's about 31 pages, but there is a table of contents at the front that can help you navigate to what you're looking for if you're looking for some specific piece of information. Among the topics it contains is communication. So in the vendor manual, you'll find a list of every MRS office that includes the address, the phone number, and the email address. So if you're ever unsure of how to get a hold of an MRS office, or if you're a new vendor and you're trying to establish contact with an MRS office, that's a great place to look. It also has email list signups. So if you're in the session, there's probably a pretty decent chance that you're already signed up to the Leo MRS vendor email listserv. But if you're not, you can access that through our website. You can access that in the vendor manual and make sure you're signed up for that. When we send out statewide communication to vendors, that's the email list that we use. So it's really important you make sure you're signed up for that to stay abreast of MRS developments that implicate vendors. And then last, it lists instances in which communication with MRS is required. So these would be things like if a critical incident occurs while providing services to an MRS participant, or if there's a change of control in your organization while you're providing services to MRS participants, things like that. There are other instances in which if you're working with MRS as a vendor, you're required to notify MRS of certain things, and it goes through those communication pieces as well. Next, it contains standard state of Michigan contract items. So anytime you're dealing with the state of Michigan, whether it be like the agency or department level, if you're fulfilling a contract or providing services through an authorization, there's these standard items that you're going to see that the state of Michigan deploys across all of its work with vendors and third-party entities throughout the state. And those would include things like a prohibition of subcontracting using the dollars that you receive from the state entity, the requirement to disclose certain legal occurrences, like if you find yourself in a lawsuit related to the services that you're authorized to provide by the state, force majeure, non-discrimination requirements, and so forth. There's a lot of standard state of Michigan items that you should be aware of, whether you're working with MRS or another entity within the state. And next up, the vendor manual contains qualifications requirements. So there are some requirements that MRS insists upon that apply no matter what type of service that you're providing as a vendor to participants of MRS. And those would include like being knowledgeable, being experienced, and being qualified to provide the relevant service type. And those are decided at the discretion of the counselor and their manager at the local level, whether you meet those thresholds. And then there are service-specific requirements. So depending on the service that you're authorized or going to be authorized to provide, or you're asking for authorization to provide that service, you might be required to hold certain credentials or licenses. So for example, there are certification requirements if you're going to be providing benefits counseling to MRS participants, or there's educational attainment requirements for providing certain levels of tutoring services. So there's a handful of service types that require those specific credentials or educational attainment or licenses, and those are listed in the vendor manual as well. So just something to be aware of for you and your staff. And then last, the Manual contains information about reporting and payment processes. And this is the majority of questions we get from vendors are related to reporting and payment. So those really highly encourage you to review those areas of the manual. There are 4 regular types of reports that are required statewide, and those would be monthly progress reports. So if you're providing, and I'm going to touch more on this later in our agenda, but if you're providing services for more than 30 days, you're required to update MRS with certain pieces of information on the progress of those services every 30 days that you are providing the services. Requests for new or additional authorization for services. So if you're asking to provide services to an MRS participant, you need to have an authorization in place. If you provide services prior to an authorization, you will not receive payment for those services. So it needs to be in writing on an authorization that is signed by MRS prior to the services being provided. If you have an existing authorization and you need additional hours beyond what was granted on the original authorization, again, you need to request those of MRS and have the authorization amended or an additional authorization granted prior to providing those additional services. There are verification of employment reports. So depending on the service type you're providing, a participant might become employed. If that happens, you're required to notify MRS of that employment. And then last, invoicing. So when the services are complete that you've been authorized to provide, what do you submit to MRS? How do you submit it in order to get paid for those services? All of those 4 reports, all the required components of each of the reports, and more information about those reported requirements are included in the vendor manual. And then lastly, authorizations for services. So the actual payment process that Bill was describing that is different from a fixed cost contract. What do those authorizations entail? How does MRS issue them? What information is going to be provided on those authorizations are all included in the vendor manual as well. So you might be asking, where do you find the vendor manual? First, you can go to the public MRS website, which is www.michigan.gov/MRS. And then you'll hit our homepage, the MRS homepage. And if you scroll down a little bit, you'll see it divides the site into like 4 main branches that it goes in from the 4 main like groups of people that we work with. And one of those is MRS for vendors. And if you click on the MRS for vendors page, you'll see a bunch of information that is relevant to vendors, including a link to access the vendor manual, recordings of previous information sessions, like the recording from this session when we're done. That's where that will be posted. And then information about how MRS developed our standardized rates of payment, which we're going to talk a little bit about later in the session as well. However, there is a second option to access the vendor manual, and I highly encourage you to navigate to this website and bookmark it and favorite it. It's called Power DMS, and the URL is public.powerdms.com/MichiganRS. It's important not to type the www dot in front of that. Start with the public.powerdms.com/MichiganMRS. That website contains all MRS public documents. That includes our agency policies, our administrative rules and regulations, publications, and as you'll see marked on the picture here on the laptop graphic, it includes the vendor manual as well. The Power DMS website is also linked from our public michigan.gov website. Again, if you scroll down on the homepage, you'll see a button that says public documents, and that will take you to this Power DMS site. We just launched this a couple months ago, so we're really excited to have a one-stop shop for all the public information documents that you could want to obtain about MRS's processes and policies. So, and that's a really short summary for a lot of information that is in the vendor manual. We have on that Michigan.gov MRS for vendors page, we have a recording posted there that is an hour-long discussion of the vendor manual and goes into a lot more detail into the components of the vendor manual. So if you want more information beyond this and what you read in the manual, I encourage you to watch that recording as well. So with that, I am going to pass it back to Bill.
Thank you, Tyler. A lot of good information in that manual here. So next up for us is Eric Bachman. I'd like to introduce him to you. He is the Division Director for Western, Central, and Northern Division here. Eric is going to talk to us about the importance of the dates on the authorizations. So take it away, Eric.
All right. Good morning, everyone. So as Bill mentioned, I just wanted to talk a little bit about authorization dates and how important they are. So what you'll see on the screen is a sample of one of our authorizations. And so it will have, on this particular sample, the customer's name is blank, but the customer's name will be entered there. There should be an authorized signature there in that column as well. And as Tyler mentioned previously, we always want to make sure vendors are aware, to not provide or start providing a service until you have an actual copy of the MRS authorization. So you might receive that authorization either through the mail, through email, through fax, but make sure you have that authorization in front of you prior to providing a service. The other thing that's really important is the period of service. So you can see it's highlighted there. So each authorization will contain a start date and an end date. It's important to note that the start date cannot be changed. So in other words, it's very important to note that you can't start providing the service until it's at least that date or within those dates that are on the authorization. Below the dates, there's a description of the service, the number of units, and the rate. And I think we'll talk about that a little bit more in the presentation this morning. But again, my focus was going to be on those dates. So again, I think the key takeaways are make sure you have a copy of the authorization. Don't start providing the service until that service start date that you'll see listed. And then the end date, that can in some circumstances be changed, but that would have to be a conversation that happens between the vendor and the counselor prior to the end date. So some circumstances that might warrant that, maybe a customer misses some appointments or has to reschedule, and so now the service is going to take longer than originally anticipated. If that's the case, the vendor would need to reach out to the MRS counselor, discuss the possibility of extending that. Sometimes if the service is going to go, there's going to be additional services provided. It might be better to have a new authorization issued. So that's why I say you should be in contact with the MRS counselor just to discuss that. And there's also some situations where we can't, under any circumstances, extend the end date. That example would be if we have an authorization that goes till the end of our fiscal year, which is September 30th, those authorizations wouldn't be able to be extended. So again, that start date is firm. The end date, depending on the circumstances, might be able to be amended, but that would have to be a discussion again with the counselor prior to that date coming up. So again, that was my focus. I wanted to talk about the period of service that's on the auth. So I will send it back to Bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Good information. So next up we have is the monthly progress reports. And again, backed by popular demand is Tyler Gross.
All right. Thanks again, Bill. So monthly progress reports is one of those 4 statewide reports that are required by MRS that I mentioned when I was discussing the vendor manual. Monthly progress reports are a report type that we get the most questions about probably from vendors. So we want to clarify what the requirements are for monthly progress reports. First, they're required every 30 days for services spanning longer than 30 days. So we're going to talk about invoicing here in a minute. If you are authorized for services that take less than a month, you don't need to provide a monthly progress report because the information that MRS needs will be provided at the time of invoicing. But if your services extend longer than 30 days based on the authorization, every 30 days of those services, you need to provide a monthly progress report for MRS. And the required components of that monthly progress report are the participant's name, the authorized service that is being provided, the total number of hours authorized, and the number of hours that have been delivered thus far at the time of the monthly progress report, and then a summary of the service provided thus far and of expectations for the completion of the service. Those four components are the minimum of what are required on monthly progress reports. MRS staff may ask you for additional information. On the authorization that's issued, there's a field that's titled Special Instructions. So sometimes MRS staff will put additional reporting requirements in that field. It doesn't have to be on the authorization though. If you provide a monthly progress report, it is completely okay for an MRS staff member to ask you, thanks for the information, but I'm curious about X, Y, and Z, and ask you for some more information on the progress, the status of the services that are being provided. So those 4 components are the minimum that is required. And MRS will communicate to you if additional reporting information is needed for a given service and authorization. And then fourth, MRS provides a monthly progress report template, but vendors may use whatever format they prefer as long as it has those 4 pieces of information on them and any additional information that has been requested by MRS. So we provide that monthly progress report template in the vendor manual. It's linked in every time that the monthly progress report is mentioned, and including that whole section on monthly progress reports in the manual. We link to that template throughout. That template is also in Power DMS, that website that I mentioned, so you can access and download it that way as well. It's a fillable PDF document that I'm going to show you in just a moment. But one other thing I wanted to mention on monthly progress reports is they have to be specific to an individual that is receiving services. So if you're providing services to multiple MRS participants at the same time, which is common for vendors that we work with frequently, for each participant that you're providing services to, you need to provide monthly progress reports for every 30 days of service if your services are extending beyond 30 days. So if you have a group, say you're providing services to like 5 MRS staff members, it's not acceptable to group all of those people into one monthly progress report and say, you know, for Sally, this is the status on this is how many hours we've provided. For Johnny, this is how many hours we provided, all on the same document. You need to tease those out into each participant that you're providing services for. And then this is what the template that MRS provides looks like for monthly progress reports. Again, it's linked in the vendor manual. It's in Power DMS. There's additional fields beyond what's shown on this slide right here that allows for additional service types, and there's a summary field at the bottom. So sometimes MRS authorizes for more than one service at a time, and that would allow you to provide updates on that more than one service. One of the nice things about using this form is that you can be sure that you have all the standard requirements required components, the MRS, those 4 components I showed just a moment ago. This form includes those 4 components. So if you complete this form, you can be sure that you've met those the standard requirements. And then another nice thing is you can see where it says the select service here on mid left side of the slide here. If you click on that, it's actually a drop-down list of the broad service categories that MRS authorizes for. So you can be sure that you're using the correct terminology in terms of service type, which will facilitate communication between you and MRS in terms of tracking what specifically you're providing the progress report for. So more information on monthly progress reports in the vendor manual, but we wanted to touch on that because we get a lot of questions about this. And it's worth mentioning, as I said, although we provide a progress report, I'm going to emphasize this again because this is probably the most common question we get. You do not have to use this template for monthly progress reports. If you have your own form that contains the 4 standard required pieces of information and any additional information MRS has requested, it's perfectly fine to use your own home created, business created forms. Additionally, it doesn't even have to be that formal. If you send an email to the MRS counselor that you're working with to authorize the service, and that email contains the required pieces of information, that can count as a monthly progress report. So it's really about communicating the pieces of information that works best with the business practices of the vendor. We provide this template just as like a standardized, hey, if you don't have a form, this is something you can use that might be useful to you. So. All right, that concludes the information that I wanted to provide on monthly progress reports, and I am going to pass it back to Bill.
Thank you. All right, up next we have Eugenia Thompson, and she is our policy manager. And for some reason, Eugenia, you got a bunch of topics to talk about here.
I do.
So you have timely billing, you have communication, you have end of year processes, you have restrictions on issuing retroactive authorizations. So take it away.
All right. Hello. Good morning, everyone. Let's see here. Gonna move these slides. So today I'll share a policies perspective related to MRS standards about invoicing and authorizations. But first, I'll talk about MRS invoicing. MRS expects vendors to submit invoices no later than 30 days completing the authorized service. So this is that final report in lieu of that 30-day report that Tyler was just mentioning. Prompt invoicing helps MRS track which services have been delivered, make timely adjustments to any individualized plan for employments when warranted, and it also helps us maintain an accurate account of our budget. The criteria reviewed by MRS staff prior to issuing authorizations is outlined in the policy that's noted here on the screen, which is our Rehabilitation Service Manual Policy 10.3, Billing and Payment for Services. So MRS staff will need the following items. As you see, the items that are highlighted in green, those are the items that must be completed. And so we have the vendor billing section. So that's where you see item number 1, and you have the dates for services there. So that must be completed. The billing amount must be completed as well. And because this will be a final bill for invoicing, the final box must be checked as well. The dates of service must align with the designated service period, as you see at the top of the screen with the green arrow there. Also, Eric just mentioned the same information, that the dates of service must align with the period of service beginning and ending date. Lastly, vendors will sign and date the authorization prior to submitting for billing. You could submit your billing documents to the counselor or the coordinator that has authorized the service directly. Also, as you see this last item here highlighted in green, this is the MRS business email address for each district office. And so if you had any concerns about contacting that MRS staff directly, you will be able to email the information right to that email address. So it's Leo MRS. It'll indicate the district office here at michigan.gov. And so when I mention submitting invoicing documents, I mean, you're submitting that authorization. You will be submitting a report or an invoice, depending on the type of services that has been provided. And the services that have been provided will determine which one. And so, for example, if job coaching services have been provided to an individual, more than likely that will be a report detailing the services that were provided to the individual, how the individual engaged in the workplace, and so forth there. If there is an invoice that is being submitted, more than likely is for an item that's being purchased, such as a hearing aid. If there are any concerns about invoicing documents that has been submitted by the vendor, the MRS staff member will reach out to make any updates. We'll discuss, of course, the concerns to resolve those concerns prior to processing payment. And again, as Tyler has mentioned, and Eric as well as Bill, communication is key. So communication is essential to delivering services to MRS customers. If you as a vendor encounter any challenges with, let's say, contacting the customer, you have the referral, the customer hasn't been answering the phone, or if you have questions about the referral that you received, what type of services that you're expected to be provided, as well as if there's any billing delays. Just a minute ago, I mentioned that the expectations is within that 30-day window. And so if you are encountering any billing delays, please connect with that MRS counselor or coordinator, as well as their manager if needed. And lastly, as Tyler just mentioned, there's information outlined in the vendor manual, and that's on page 24 through 29. All right, so next I'm just going to give you a briefing on how to navigate obtaining not the vendor, but the district office email address. And so while the specific district office email address is at the bottom of that authorization from that local office that counselor resides in, if you, for whatever reason, need that full list is located in 2 different areas. And one area is in the Power DMS, as Tyler had mentioned earlier. And so what you would do is you'll navigate through our policy. So you'll see some highlighted areas in green here. You'll go to the Michigan Rehabilitation Service Manual Policy. You'll tap down to the Policy tab. And then the last tab, you will go to the Administrative Policies, and then there'll be several nested folders. However, you'll look in the Technology Resource folder, and there you will have a list of all the MRS district offices, as well as their business email address. Also, this information is located in the vendor manual on page 4 through 6. All right, so as I close, I just want to provide some important reminders here. And so invoices are expected to be submitted no later than 30 days after the provision of services. And we do have our fiscal year, end of the fiscal year approaching actually on September 30th, 2025. And timely invoicing remains essential. However, it is heightened during this period. And so we ask that all invoicing documents are submitted promptly, especially as we near the end of the fiscal year. Please ensure all of your reports, whether it's the invoice, the report that you're submitting, ensuring that that summarizes the services or goods that has been provided in alignment with the authorization for services. Again, I know we can't stress this enough, but communication is key. We are helping individuals with disabilities in achieving their employment outcome. And so communicate concerns promptly with MRS staff, including managers when necessary. As you take a look in our vendor manual on page 7, there's also encouragement to reach out to MRS staff as well. And for whatever reason, if you're not able to get answers at the district office level, there is a vendor mailbox, as you see noted here, and that can also be found in the vendor manual, as I mentioned. Lastly, one of the questions that comes up kind of often is about payment. You know, when am I going to get paid? Where am I at in the payment process? And so, just would want to direct everyone to access, you know, vendor self-service. So this is Sigma VSS. You can track your payments there, get your invoicing numbers to be able to track payments, as I just mentioned. There's a representative at Sigma Self-Service that will be available Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. There is a link to the Sigma website also in the vendor manual on page 4. And then next, I'll pass it on back to you, Bill.
All right. Tyler, if you could. So we're going to talk about, I get to talk about the next two here. First thing we want to talk about is vendor vetting. And vendor vetting is not a federal term. It is a term that we've created here at MRS. And basically what vendor vetting is to make sure that the vendor is appropriate for our customers here. So that's our definition, but there is a federal requirement concerning vendor vetting, and that is the review for suspension and debarment. Want to explain it for a minute what that is and who does that and how it impacts the ability of our vendors to provide services here. Suspension and debarment is a process that is performed by the federal government. And what that consists of is when they identify a vendor who they have great concerns with, they do a review on that vendor. The outcome of that review may be that they either suspend or debar that vendor. And I want to read the one sentence in here because this is right out of the federal regs. The suspension and debarment process protects the federal government from fraud, waste, and abuse by using a number of tools to avoid doing business with the non-responsible contractors. One of those tools that we are required to use is the webpage sam.gov. sam.gov identifies all vendors who have been debarred or suspended. And again, you can be suspended for fraud, waste, racketeering, any type of criminal activities you may be debarred from. So what happens is once you are debarred, you are usually debarred for a period of no greater than 3 years. So our process here is kind of twofold. First of all, MRS performs a review that is, we go on sam.gov and check all new vendors who have come into our system to determine whether or not they have been debarred or suspended. So that 140 that we talked about this morning when we said how many we have new in this year, we are currently doing debarment checks on all of those. We also do debarment checks on existing vendors, and our backload is fairly large. We attempt to do a review every year. We're a little bit behind that right now. We're doing these debarment and suspension checks. A vendor who has been debarred or suspended is prohibited from providing services. The actual wording that is used in the federal regulation is they are barred from participating in any federal award. And what that means is they are not only barred here from providing services from MRS, but from any federally funded program in the state of Michigan. Next one, please. So vendor vetting is our next one, and this is a less structured process, but it still falls under that definition. And this is dependent upon the district office that you're working with and what types of programs that you're servicing for us. Is the district office may request certain licensing and credentialing information and insurances, and that's just to make sure you have the proper background and ability to serve our customers. The last thing is iChat. We are now in the process of completing our iChat process, and this was a pilot, and we wanted to determine whether or not if we could do iChats on our vendors. So we are still in that process. And if you're familiar with doing business with DHHS, you know that iChat is a standard step in their process. We would like to incorporate that into our process because, again, it provides additional protections for our customers. And go to the next one, please. We'll talk about rates. All right, vendor rates. So constantly we get the same two questions about our rates. The first question is, how do you develop a rate? And then the most key question is, what's the dollar amount of that rate? So I want to read this to you real quick, and then I'm going to answer those two questions. There's a fee schedule and standardized rates for purchase service. And standardized means they are the same all over the state of Michigan. MRS maintains a fee schedule of standardized rates and payments for selected VR services. Standardized rates of payments amounts were developed in partnership with Public Consulting Group. That is a group that we hired to assist us in developing rates because the computation of the rates are so complex. To compute a rate within the requirements of the federal government we have to be consistent with our federal grant, the federal cost circulars, and the state procurement requirements. So the answer to how we do that is we ensure that we comply with all three of these areas, and there's where Public Consulting Group assists us in doing that. The second thing you want to know is how much are the rates? And again, that's going to be in our vendor manual. So the next time you look at our vendor manual, one of the links is going to tell you the dollar amounts of each one of our rates. And if you're a person who likes accounting and you like data and you got a couple extra free hours for you, there is also another link in there that shows the PCG report that shows you how we went step by step in developing the rates that we are using right now. All right, Tyler, that's all I have for both rates and vendor vetting. So I think Eugenia is on again with more complex topics.
Yes, I am back. All right, let's get to the next slide. All right, so now I'll provide an overview related to the some key elements behind the scenes that MRS staff must consider prior to authorizing for services, and those are comparable services and benefits, as well as the least costs to the agency. So I'll talk about those two items. So as you all may know, that vocational rehabilitation programs were governed by the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 34, Part 361. This regulation outlines the standards for VR services administered by state agencies such as MRS. The Code of Federal Regulations are a set of rules published by the federal agencies to implement. They're implemented and passed by Congress, and it ensures consistency and compliance across the United States. And so here is a reference from the federal regulations. This is a component of an authorization, which includes the requirement for MRS staff to seek comparable services and benefits prior to issuing any vocational rehabilitation services. Yes, there are exemptions located in the Code of Federal Regulations, as well as our MRS policy. However, today I'm just going to provide an overview of comparable services and benefits, and then we'll move on to the least cost to the agency. So first, let's define comparable services and benefits. This may or may not be your first time hearing about these. So comparable services and benefits are services or benefits provided for or paid for in whole or part So a tongue twister there, right? And they're paid for by either another federal entity, a state entity, a local public agency, health insurance, or employee benefits. And so as you see outlined here, we just have a couple of examples. So these are items that a counselor must explore. This is not inclusive of all examples of a state entity, federal entity, and so forth, but just to provide you an example prior to that authorization for services, what the MRS staff member must do. Comparable services and benefits must be available at the time needed, and they also need to be equivalent to the level of services an individual would receive through MRS. And so I know I said a mouthful. And so you may be wondering, what does in whole mean? What does in part mean, right? And I'll explain that now. So in whole means another entity will absorb the full cost of a particular service. So for example, MRS is working with an individual. This individual may need mental health counseling. The MRS staff member will explore, let's say the state entity, right? We have Department of Health and Human Services here as an example. So that counselor or coordinator will take a look at Department of Health and Human Services to determine if there's a benefit there to help an individual receive mental health counseling. Now, if the individual has health insurance or if the individual is working, the employee assistance program might be explored for mental health counseling, just for an example of what does in whole mean. So in part means that MRS may absorb a portion of the cost of a particular service, in addition to another entity might absorb a portion of a particular service. So I'm going to use the example of, post-secondary training here. And so, individuals that work with MRS, they are required to complete the federal student aid application. So in this example, we're going to look at a federal entity. And so the individual completes FAFSA, the FAFSA application, and is awarded a Pell Grant. So that Pell Grant would pay part, contribute part of the cost for post-secondary training, and then MRS may also contribute a portion of post-secondary training. And so that is a requirement for our vocational counselors to explore prior to authorizing for services. And again, yes, there are some exemptions to this exploration. MRS staff responsibilities for exploring comparable services and benefits are located in our RSM 7.2, comparable services and benefits. If you wanted to take a look at that, Tyler did mention how to navigate to our policy manual in Power DMS. So next, I'll share the other item, that component for authorizations is exploring the least cost principle. So MRS staff members must explore the least cost to the agency while also meeting the individual's vocational rehabilitation need. And so there is a state law associated with this requirement, and that state law is noted here. I'm not going to read these two, but essentially it's saying that, we're looking at the least cost that's going to meet the individual vocational rehabilitation need. In order to, if you would like to take a look at our administrative rules, that's also noted in our policy manual that's located in Power DMS, and that's Rule 395.53, subsection 4, and then Rule 395.76, subsection 3. In many of our MRS service policies, we do speak to looking at the least cost to meet the individual's need. Now, we have our RSM, which is a policy, 10.1, the fee schedule and rate of payment. This policy states that MRS is prohibited from supporting cost of a service that exceeds the least cost service that meets the individual vocational rehabilitation need. So you all know, Bill just mentioned, we have standard rates for many services that MRS provides. However, when there is no established rate for payment that exists, that's when, the MRS staff member is going to explore that option of that least cost. So I just want to provide an example of, what that looks like in action. And so here's an example. If we're working, MRS, I'll say, we're working with an individual that is in need of a hearing aid to perform their job duties effectively, right? That individual has had a hearing assessment. There's been some hearing aids that have been recommended. And in that recommendation, there are two options. So there's option A, And option A is a premium hearing aid with advanced features like Bluetooth technology for streaming and noise cancellation. That in the cost is $4,500. Option B is a basic hearing aid. This hearing aid, though, meets the individual vocational need. This hearing aid enables the individual to perform their job duties effectively, and the cost of that hearing aid is $3,000. So although option A offers these extra features, as I mentioned, option B is the least cost, and it also meets the individual needs. Therefore, MRS will authorize for option B. Next, I'll provide an example of utilizing the least cost principle and comparable services and benefits. So just want to tie those two together to demonstrate what that looks like. So I'm not going to read the examples again, but in this example for comparable services and benefit, it is noted that the individual has an insurance benefit of $500. So this $500 will reduce the cost for option A to $4,000 and will reduce the cost for option B to $2,500. And so as the MRS counselor is moving forward with authorizing for this particular service, that counselor may, note in their rationale something similar to what the statement that you see here. I'm not going to read it word from word, just going to paraphrase this really quick. So there's an authorization of $2,500 being issued to ABC Hearing Clinic, which is the least cost of the agency. The customer has a insurance benefit of $500. In this instance, we do consider customer contribution as well. So that's another component of authorizing for services. But customer contribution is not required. The customer's financial contribution is only required when the individual selects a service or item that exceeds the least costs that meet that individual's need. Now, in this instance here, there is a difference. So let's say the customer wanted to go for the select the premium hearing aid, right? So that's option A. And so the difference between $4,000 and $2,500 is $1,500. So that will be the financial contribution of the individual. MRS may only approve a higher cost item if the lower cost alternative does not adequately meet the individual's vocational rehabilitation needs. All right, so I want to provide some key reminders here. No, we're on the call with vendors, and you may wonder, okay, how does this factor into me providing services to an individual, working with MRS? And so just some key reminders here are before an MRS staff member authorizes for a service, they must determine whether a comparable service or benefit exists anywhere else unless that service is exempt. If there is another agency that can provide that service, such as Medicaid, like I mentioned earlier, perhaps for mental health counseling, or a school that might be providing some sort of pre-employment transition services, or an employer, the vocational rehabilitation agency, and in this situation, that's us, MRS, we must utilize that resource first. Vendors, you may be asked to verify whether there's a comparable service or benefit through insurance that could cover part or all of the cost of a particular service. And then lastly, relating to the least cost option, vendors, you may be asked to submit different quotes or cost estimates, especially when there is no established rate for a particular service, right? And then if there are multiple vendors providing the same service, again, we're looking at the least cost service that's going to meet the individual's needs. And so here it is important to note before informing a customer or individual that you might be working with about what MRS may or may not be able to authorize for, please consult with the MRS staff member first. And so in summary, just wanted to let you all know that, we have some requirements about comparable services and benefits, and we must utilize those services when they are available. And MRS, we are looking at the least costs to meet the individual's needs, and the measures that we have in place within the agency helps MRS ensure that we are compliant with both federal and state regulations. And next, I will pass it back to you, Bill.
Okay, thank you, Eugenia. A lot of good information. We're at our closing remarks right now. Yeah, Tyler, go to the next one, please. Here's just a summary of some of the things that we talked about. is the vendor manual is available. And then remember this about the vendor manual, we're always adding information to it. So what you see today could be completely different tomorrow by us adding some more good information for you to help you be a good vendor for us here. The service dates must be correct and service completed within the authorization dates. We talked about that. Please submit billing authorizations timely and no later than 30 days. If you bill us quickly, we're going to pay you quickly. All vendors are checked for debarment and other vetting procedures. Rates are established for almost all of our services. And finally, the understanding of policy of least cost and comparable benefits, really important when you provide us those services here. Tyler, if you can go to the last one, please. So Tyler brought this up at the beginning of this seminar here, is that you're going to get a survey, and you can help us out by filling out this survey. Tell us what information you need from us to be a vendor to provide really good services here. And the other thing that's on there also is question and answers. If you have any questions about this, please write them down and report those to us. We're going to get an answer back to you, and it's going to be distributed to everybody who is attending this conference. So in closing, I want to thank all of our vendors, our new ones, and the ones that have been here for a while. Thank you for attending. And what I really hope is that soon we can do some more seminars on some different items that relate to our vendors. And again, thank you.